The morning sun rose over New Geneva Colony like any other day. Commander Jake Morrison stood at his office window, watching the children play in the gardens below. Their laughter echoed across the settlement, a sound that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. Human children ran alongside small blue Centauri youngsters, while the tall, thin, ethereal children moved with their strange, graceful steps. Haven House sat in the center of the colony like a bright jewel. The massive building stretched across 12 acres, its white walls gleaming in the morning light. Gardens surrounded it on all sides, filled with plants from dozens of different worlds. The children called it home, and Jake had spent the last 5 years making sure it stayed safe. Dr. Lisa Carter walked through the medical wing, checking on the newest arrivals. 3 human children had come in last week, their parents lost in a mining accident on Kepler 7. A young Vorthan child sat quietly in the corner, his gray skin marked with the ritual scars of his people. His family had been killed in a clan war, and he was the only survivor. "Good morning, Kex," Lisa said softly to the Vorthan child. He looked up at her with large, dark eyes, but said nothing. The trauma was still too fresh. Lisa had seen it before with children from war zones. Time and patience would heal him, just like it had healed so many others. Helen Brooks made her way through the dining hall, watching as the children ate their breakfast. She had run Haven House for 8 years, and each child who passed through its doors left a mark on her heart. The facility housed over 800 children at any given time, all of them orphans from conflicts across the galaxy. "Miss Helen," called out a small human girl with bright red hair. "Denny won't share his juice." Helen smiled and walked over to settle the dispute. These were the moments that made all the hard work worth it. The children didn't care about species or politics. They just wanted to be safe, to be loved, to have a place to call home. The Vorthan Empire had been expanding for months. Their ships moved through space like sharks, taking what they wanted and destroying what they couldn't use. Jake had read the intelligence reports. The Vorthans believed that strength came from conquest, that mercy was a weakness that should be crushed. Admiral Zexthal stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Destroyer of Worlds. His gray skin was covered in battle scars, each one a mark of honor in Vorthan culture. He had received his orders from the High Command that morning. The humans had grown too soft, too comfortable in their peaceful ways. It was time to remind them that the galaxy was not a safe place. "Admiral," his second-in-command said, "we are approaching the human colony. Our sensors show minimal defenses." Zexthal nodded. The humans had grown weak, caring more about their alien pets than their own survival. Today would teach them the price of such foolishness. Jake was reviewing the morning reports when his communication system came alive. Lieutenant Kevin Park's voice crackled through the speakers, urgent and frightened. "Commander Morrison, we have multiple ships dropping out of hyperspace. They're not responding to our signals." Jake rushed to the command center, his heart already racing. The main screen showed 5 massive Vorthan warships in formation, their dark hulls bristling with weapons. He had never seen so many enemy ships this close to a civilian target. "Send an immediate distress signal to Fleet Command," Jake ordered. "Get me a direct line to Haven House. We need to start evacuation procedures." But even as he spoke, Jake knew they didn't have enough time. The Vorthan ships were already moving into attack position. Helen Brooks was reading to a group of younger children when the alarms began to sound. The soft, musical tone that meant a drill quickly changed to the harsh, urgent wail that meant real danger. She had practiced this moment countless times, but she never thought it would actually happen. "Children, we need to go to the safe rooms now," Helen said, keeping her voice calm and steady. "Just like we practiced." The children began to move, some crying, others asking questions she couldn't answer. Helen helped guide them toward the reinforced shelters deep underground. The facility had been built to withstand natural disasters, but she wasn't sure how well it would hold against military weapons. Dr. Lisa Carter was in the medical wing when the first explosions rocked the building. The lights flickered and dust fell from the ceiling. She quickly began moving her patients, starting with the youngest and most vulnerable. A human baby, barely 3 months old, lay in her arms as she ran toward the shelter. The Vorthan ships opened fire without warning. Bright beams of energy lanced down from space, striking the colony with devastating force. The first shots hit the power station and the communication array, cutting New Geneva off from the outside. Galaxy. Jake watched in horror as the enemy fire began to focus on Haven House. The beams tore through the building's walls like paper, sending chunks of metal and stone flying in all directions. Children's screams could be heard even over the sound of the explosions. "Why are they targeting the orphanage?" Lieutenant Park asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Jake didn't have an answer. In all his years of military service, he had never seen anyone deliberately target children. There were unspoken rules in galactic warfare, lines that no civilized species would cross. Admiral Zexthal watched the destruction with satisfaction. The humans would learn that their weakness had consequences. Their soft hearts and foolish compassion would be their downfall. Let them try to negotiate when their precious children lay dead in the ruins. "Continue firing," he ordered. "Level the entire facility. Leave nothing standing." The bombardment continued for 20 minutes. When it finally stopped, Haven House was gone. Where the beautiful building had stood, only smoking rubble remained. The gardens were turned to ash, the playground's twisted metal and broken concrete. Jake led the first rescue team into the ruins. The air was thick with smoke and dust, making it hard to breathe. Emergency lights flickered in the darkness, casting strange shadows on the devastated landscape. They found Helen Brooks trapped under a collapsed beam, barely alive. Blood ran down her face and her left arm was clearly broken, but her eyes were alert, focused on Jake with desperate intensity. "The children," she whispered. "You have to find the children." Jake knelt beside her as the medics worked to free her from the debris. "We're looking, Helen, we're going to find them." But as the hours passed, the truth became clear. The underground shelters had been crushed by the falling building. The medical wing was completely destroyed. Of the 847 children who had called Haven House home, only 33 survived. Gar Lisa Carter was found unconscious near the ruins of the medical wing, the 3-month-old baby still clutched in her arms. Both had survived by hiding in a supply closet that had somehow escaped the destruction. When she woke up and learned about the others, she didn't speak for 3 days. The Vorthan ships had left as suddenly as they had arrived, disappearing into hyperspace without a word. They had accomplished their mission. The humans had been taught a lesson about the price of weakness. Jake stood in the ruins as the sun set over New Geneva colony. Bodies were still being pulled from the wreckage, most of them too small to be adults. The colony's morgue couldn't handle the number of casualties. Temporary shelters had been set up in the main square to hold the victims. Until transport ships could arrive, the communication array had been repaired, and messages were already flowing back to Earth and the other human colonies. The news would spread quickly through human space, and Jake knew that something fundamental had changed. The Vorthans had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. As he walked through the ruins, Jake found a small toy bear, scorched and dirty but still recognizable. He picked it up and held it in his hands, feeling the weight of what had been lost. The Vorthans thought they had shown human weakness, but they had no idea what they had actually done. They had awakened something that had been sleeping in the human heart, something that would not rest until justice was served. The news reached Earth 3 days after the bombing. President William Stone stood in the Oval Office, watching the footage that had been sent from New Geneva colony. The images showed the ruins of Haven House, the small bodies being pulled from the wreckage, the survivors crying over their lost friends. Stone had been president for 6 years. He had dealt with trade disputes, border conflicts, and diplomatic crises, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. He watched as rescue workers carried out a tiny Centauri child, her blue skin pale and lifeless. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old. "Mr. President," his aide said quietly, "the Federation Council is waiting for your response." Stone nodded but didn't turn away from the screen. He watched as Commander Jake Morrison knelt beside the body of a human boy, tears streaming down. His face, the child had been maybe 7 years old, still clutching a toy spaceship in his small hands. "Cancel all my appointments," Stone said finally. "I need to address the nation." The presidential address was broadcast across all human worlds at the same time. Stone stood behind his desk, his usual calm demeanor replaced by something harder, colder. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that few had ever heard before. "My fellow humans," he began, "3 days ago, the Vorthan Empire committed an act of unthinkable evil. They deliberately targeted and destroyed Haven House, an orphanage that cared for children from across the galaxy. 814 innocent children died in this attack." Stone paused, letting the number sink in. These children were under our protection. They trusted us to keep them safe. We failed them. Across human space, people stopped what they were doing to listen. In homes and offices, on ships and stations, humanity held its breath. "The Vorthans believe they have shown us the price of compassion," Stone continued. "They think they have taught us that mercy is weakness, that caring for others makes us vulnerable. They are wrong." The president's voice grew harder. "Today, I am declaring a state of total war against the Vorthan Empire. We will not stop until every ship in their fleet is destroyed, every weapon in their arsenal is broken, and every leader who ordered this atrocity is brought to justice." The declaration sent shockwaves through human civilization. The Terran Federation had not declared total war in over a century. Most people had never heard the term used in their lifetime. Colonel Ryan Peters was in the middle of a training exercise when the news reached his unit. The Terran Marines were the elite fighting force of human space, trained for the worst conflicts the galaxy could offer. But when Peters told his men about Haven House, the training ground fell silent. Sergeant Tony Clark, a veteran of 15 years, sat down hard on a supply crate. He had 3 children of his own back on Earth. The thought of them being targeted by enemy ships made him feel sick. "Sir," said Lieutenant Bobby Harris, "what are our orders?" Peters looked at his men, these hardened warriors who had seen combat on a dozen worlds. He saw something in their eyes that he had never seen before. It wasn't anger or rage. It was something deeper, something colder. "We're going to war," Peters said simply. "Real war. The kind our grandfathers fought." Admiral Kate Sullivan stood in the command center of the Terran Fleet headquarters, watching as ships from across human space began to converge. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and carriers were all being called to active duty. The peaceful merchant vessels that usually carried goods between worlds were being converted into troop transports. "Ma'am," said Captain Eddie Mitchell, "we're receiving volunteer requests from civilian crews. Cargo haulers, passenger liners, even private yachts, they all want to help." Sullivan nodded grimly. The attack on Haven House had touched something deep in the human psyche. People who had never held a weapon in their lives were signing up for military service. Factory workers were volunteering for overtime to build more ships and weapons. "What about our allies?" Sullivan asked. "The Centauri Republic has offered to share their advanced weapons technology," Mitchell replied. "The Ethereal Collective is providing intelligence on Vorthan movements. Even the neutral worlds are offering support." Sullivan wasn't surprised. The Vorthans had made a mistake in targeting children. Every species in the galaxy understood the unspoken rule that the young were off-limits in warfare. By breaking that rule, the Vorthans had turned themselves into galactic outcasts. Dr. Marcus Webb sat in his laboratory, studying the biological data on Vorthan physiology. As the Federation's leading expert on alien species, he had been called in to help plan the military response. The government wanted to know how to fight the Vorthans most effectively. "Their nervous system is different from ours," Webb explained to the assembled military commanders. "They feel pain differently, process fear differently. What would terrify a human might not affect a Vorthan at all. Then how do we make them afraid?" asked General Carl Johnson. Webb was quiet for a long moment. "We don't make them afraid of us," he said finally. "We make them afraid of what they've awakened in us." The first human response came exactly 1 week after the bombing. A small Vorthan patrol ship was detected near the edge of human space, probably gathering intelligence on Federation defenses. Instead of the usual diplomatic protests or warning shots, the human response was swift and absolute. The patrol ship was destroyed in seconds, torn apart by weapons that seemed to appear from nowhere. The Vorthans didn't even have time to send a distress signal. When other Vorthan ships arrived to investigate, they found only debris and a single message beacon. The message was simple: "You killed our children. This is the consequence." Admiral Zexthel received the report on his flagship deep in Vorthan space. The destruction of the patrol ship had been thorough and professional. The humans had used advanced stealth technology and precision weapons. It was not the work of an emotional, grieving species. Perhaps we underestimated them, his second-in-command suggested. Zexthel dismissed the concern with a wave of his hand. One patrol ship means nothing. The humans are simply lashing out in their pain. When they realize the full cost of war, they will come begging for peace. But the attacks continued. Human ships began appearing throughout Vorthan space, striking at military targets with surgical precision. Supply convoys were destroyed, communication stations were taken offline, and forward bases were reduced to rubble. The Vorthans had expected angry retaliation, but this was something else entirely. The humans fought with a cold efficiency that was almost mechanical. They took no prisoners, offered no mercy, and seemed to feel no satisfaction in their victories. Colonel Ryan Peters led his Marines in the assault on Vorthan Station 7. The facility had been used as a staging ground for raids on civilian targets. Peters and his men moved through the station like a force of nature, methodically clearing each section. "No survivors," Peters ordered as they reached the command center. It wasn't cruelty or revenge. It was simply the logical response to an enemy that had shown no mercy to children. The station's commander, a Vorthan officer named Kethver, tried to surrender. He offered information about other military installations, promised to cooperate. With human forces, Peters looked at him with cold, empty eyes. "You should have thought of that before you bombed the orphanage," Peters said, and pulled the trigger. Dr. Lisa Carter had returned to duty despite her injuries from the Haven House attack. She now worked at a military hospital, treating wounded soldiers and preparing for the casualties that would come from the expanding war. But the Lisa Carter who had once cared for alien children was gone, replaced by someone harder. "Doctor," a young medic asked, "shouldn't we be treating the Vorthan prisoners?" Lisa looked at the medic with the same cold expression that had become common among humans. "What prisoners?" she asked. The medic understood. The humans weren't taking prisoners anymore. The Vorthans had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and now they would face the consequences. Back on Earth, President Stone met with his military advisors. The war was expanding rapidly, with human forces striking at Vorthan positions across 3 star systems. The enemy was beginning to realize that this wasn't a typical conflict. "Sir," said General Johnson, "we're receiving communication requests from the Vorthan High Command. They want to discuss terms." Stone's expression didn't change. "What terms?" "They're offering reparations for the orphanage attack. They want to negotiate a ceasefire." Stone thought about the children he had seen in the footage from Haven House. The little girl with the toy bear. The boy who had been learning to read. The Vorthan child who had been orphaned by his own people's wars. "Tell them we'll consider their offer," Stone said finally. "After we've destroyed their entire fleet." The president's response was broadcast to every human ship in the galaxy. The message was clear: there would be no mercy, no negotiation, no peace until the Vorthan Empire was completely destroyed. Humanity had been awakened to war, and they would not sleep again until justice was served. Captain Danny Rodriguez crouched in the shadows of the Vorthan command ship, his team of 12 Marines spread out behind him. They had been hunting Admiral Zexthel for 2 months, the alien who had given the order to bomb Haven House. Tonight, they would finally have their revenge. The stealth insertion had taken 6 hours. Human technology had advanced rapidly since the war began, driven by a need for better weapons and better ways to kill Vorthans. The new cloaking systems could hide entire ships from enemy sensors, allowing strike teams to get close to their targets. Target is 3 levels up, whispered Sergeant Nick Davis through the comm system. Heavy security, but they don't know we're here. Rodriguez nodded and signaled his team to move. They had practiced this mission dozens of times on mock-ups of Vorthan ships. Every corridor, every access panel, every security station was memorized. The humans moved like ghosts through the enemy vessel. The war had been going on for 8 months now. What had started as surgical strikes had grown into something much bigger. 3 star systems were now active combat zones, with human and Vorthan fleets clashing in brutal battles that left entire worlds scarred. Colonel Amy Harrison stood on the bridge of the UES Vengeance, watching as her ships prepared for another assault. The Vorthan military base on Kepler 9 had been sending reinforcements to the front lines for weeks. Today, that would end. "All ships report ready, Colonel," said Commander Julie Roberts. "Begin the attack," Harrison ordered. The human fleet moved with perfect coordination. Battleships opened fire with their main guns, while smaller ships launched missile salvos. The Vorthan defenders tried to respond, but they were outgunned and outmanned. Harrison watched the enemy base burn on her screen. She felt no satisfaction, no joy in the destruction. The humans had learned to fight like machines, cold and efficient. Emotions were a luxury they could no longer afford. "Ma'am," Robert said, "we're receiving a surrender signal from the base commander." "Ignore it," Harrison replied. "Continue firing until there's nothing left." The colonel's orders were followed. Without question, the Vorthan base was completely destroyed, along with everyone inside. The humans had stopped taking prisoners months ago. The Vorthans had shown no mercy to children, so they would receive none in return. Admiral Zexthal paced his command center, watching the reports pour in from across the Empire. Human forces were everywhere, striking at military targets with devastating effectiveness. His people were beginning to panic. "Sir," his communications officer said, "we're losing contact with outposts in the Rigel sector. The humans have destroyed our relay stations." Zexthal snarled in frustration. The humans were supposed to be weak, emotional creatures who would crumble under pressure. Instead, they fought with a ruthless efficiency that the Vorthans had never encountered. "What about our allies?" he asked. The hegemony promised support. "They've withdrawn their forces, sir. They say the war has become too costly." Zexthal felt a chill run down his spine. The Vorthans had always counted on their reputation for brutality to keep other species in line. But now, faced with human determination, their allies were abandoning them. Captain Rodriguez and his team reached the command level of the Vorthan ship. The corridors were filled with enemy soldiers, but the humans had something the Vorthans didn't expect: complete knowledge of their biology. Dr. Marcus Webb's research had revealed that Vorthans had a weakness in their nervous system. Specific sounds could cause them intense pain, even unconsciousness. The human Marines carried sonic weapons designed to exploit this vulnerability. "Deploy sound charges," Rodriguez whispered, the weapons activated with a high-pitched whine that human ears couldn't detect. But the Vorthans screamed and collapsed, clutching their heads in agony. The Marines moved through the disabled enemies like death itself. They found Admiral Zexthal in his private quarters, trying to destroy classified documents. The alien looked up as the humans entered, his dark eyes filled with something the Marines had never seen before: fear. "You cannot do this," Zexthal said in broken English. "I am a prisoner of war. There are rules." Rodriguez stepped forward, his face hidden behind a combat mask. "You should have thought about rules before you killed our children." The Admiral tried to speak, but Rodriguez raised his weapon. The sonic blast hit Zexthal at point-blank range, and the alien collapsed. The Marines zip-tied his hands and feet, then carried him to their extraction point. General Paul Martinez stood in the ruins of a Vorthan prison camp, his soldiers searching through the wreckage. They had liberated the facility 2 days ago, but what they found inside had shaken even the hardened veterans. The Vorthans had been experimenting on their prisoners. Humans, Centauri, Ethereals, and other species had been subjected to torture and biological testing. The survivors were barely alive, their bodies and minds broken by months of abuse. "Sir," said Major Frank Cooper, "we found the research files. The Vorthans were trying to develop new biological weapons." Martinez felt his anger grow even colder. The enemy wasn't just cruel, they were actively trying to find new ways to cause suffering. The general made a decision that would affect the entire course of the war. "Send a message to all human forces," he ordered. "No more prisoner camps. No more captured equipment. From now on, we destroy everything." The order spread through the human military like wildfire. The war changed overnight from a conflict with rules to something much darker. Human forces began systematically destroying everything they encountered. Vorthan military bases, supply depots, communication stations, and even civilian infrastructure were all targeted. Lieutenant Kelly Johnson monitored Vorthan communications from her station aboard the UES Retribution. The enemy's messages were becoming more desperate with each passing day. Their military leaders were arguing among themselves, their supply lines were collapsing, and their people were beginning to doubt their government. "Ma'am," she reported to Admiral Kate Sullivan, "we're intercepting panic transmissions from the Vorthan homeworlds. They're requesting immediate reinforcements." Sullivan nodded grimly. The Vorthans were finally beginning to understand what they had unleashed. But it was too late for regrets now. Captain Rodriguez returned to the human fleet with his prisoner. Admiral Zexthal was brought before a military tribunal, but the trial was brief. The evidence of his crimes was overwhelming, and the sentence was death. "Do you have any last words?" asked the presiding judge. Zexthal looked at the assembled humans with haunted eyes. "We thought you were weak," he said quietly. "We thought your compassion made you vulnerable. We were wrong." The execution was carried out immediately. The alien who had ordered the destruction of Haven House was dead, but his death brought no peace to the humans. There were still thousands of Vorthans who had participated in the attack, and they would all pay the same price. Dr. Lisa Carter worked in a field hospital near the front lines, treating wounded soldiers and preparing for the next wave of casualties. The war had changed her, just as it had changed all of humanity. The gentle doctor who had once cared for alien children was gone, replaced by someone harder and colder. "Doctor," a young medic asked, "when do you think this will end?" Lisa looked up from her work, her eyes empty of warmth. "When they're all dead," she said simply. The medic nodded and went back to his duties. That was the reality of the war now. Humanity had been pushed beyond its breaking point, and there was no going back. President Stone received daily reports from the front lines. The war was going well from a military standpoint, but the cost was becoming clear. Humanity was winning, but they were losing something essential in the process. "Sir," his aide said, "the Vorthan Emperor is requesting a meeting. He wants to discuss terms." Stone considered the request. The enemy was clearly desperate, but the American president had made a promise to the children of Haven House. Justice would be served, no matter the cost. "Tell him we'll meet," Stone said finally, "but only to discuss their surrender." The war continued to rage across the galaxy, but its outcome was no longer in doubt. The Vorthans had awakened something in humanity that they couldn't control or defeat. The only question now was how complete their destruction would be. The war had consumed 18 months of time and 3 entire star systems. Engineer Ben Clark stood in his laboratory, putting the finishing touches on humanity's newest weapon. The device was small, no bigger than a briefcase, but it could kill every Vorthan on a ship in minutes. The weapon used sound waves tuned specifically to Vorthan brain patterns. Dr. Marcus Webb's research had shown that the right frequency could cause massive seizures in their nervous system. Clark had turned that discovery into a weapon of war. "Test results are perfect," Clark told General Carl Johnson. "One device can clear a battleship in under 10 minutes. The Vorthans will die, but other species won't be affected." Johnson nodded grimly. The weapon was cruel and efficient, designed specifically to terrify the enemy. The humans had learned that fear was just as powerful as explosives in warfare. "How many can you build?" Johnson asked. "As many as you need, sir. The factories are working around the clock." The general approved. The weapon for immediate deployment. Within weeks, human strike teams would be carrying the devices into battle, turning enemy ships into floating tombs. Commander Sue Adams stood on the bridge of the UES Devastation, watching as her fleet approached Vorthen Prime, the enemy's capital. World hung in space like a gray marble, surrounded by massive defense stations and hundreds of warships. "All ships report ready, Commander," said Captain Gary Wilson. "Begin the siege," Adams ordered. The human fleet spread out in a perfect sphere around the planet, cutting off all escape routes. No ship would leave Vorthen Prime, no message would get through. The world would be isolated until its people surrendered or starved. The blockade was complete and absolute. Human ships patrolled every possible exit point, while automated mines filled the spaces between. The Vorthens were trapped on their own world, watching their empire crumble around them. Emperor Kethmar stood in his palace throne room, staring out at the human ships that filled his sky. The once mighty Vorthen Empire now controlled only this single world, and even that was slipping from his grasp. "Your Majesty," his advisor said nervously, "the food supplies will last only 6 more months. The people are already beginning to panic." Kethmar had ruled the empire for 20 years, expanding their territory through conquest and fear. But he had never faced an enemy like the humans. They fought with a cold determination that seemed inhuman. "What news from our other worlds?" the Emperor asked. "Gone, Majesty, all of them. The humans have destroyed every military installation, every government building, every symbol of Vorthen power. Our people are scattered across the galaxy in refugee camps." The Emperor felt his heart sink. The Vorthen Empire had been built over centuries, and the humans had destroyed it in less than 2 years. All because of one moment of cruelty at a place called Haven House. Dr. Nancy Rivers walked through the human military hospital, studying the psychological effects of the war on her soldiers. What she found disturbed her more than any physical wound. The humans had become something new during the conflict. They showed no emotion in battle, no hesitation when killing, no regret after victory. They had turned themselves into perfect killing machines. "Doctor," said Sergeant Mike Thompson, "when do you think we'll go home?" Rivers looked at the young soldier. He had been fighting Vorthens for over a year, and his eyes had the same cold emptiness she saw in all the veterans. "I don't know," she admitted, "but when we do, we'll be different people." Thompson nodded and walked away. Rivers understood that the war had changed humanity forever. Even when the fighting stopped, they would never be the same peaceful species they had been before. Haven House. The human war machine had grown beyond anything the galaxy had ever seen. Every human world was producing weapons, ships, and soldiers. Factories that had once made toys and furniture now built missiles and guns. Schools taught children how to fight instead of how to read. President Stone received reports from across human space. The economy had been completely converted to military production. Crime had disappeared as every citizen focused on the war. Effort, even art and music, had become about fighting and victory. "Sir," his aide said, "we're receiving another surrender offer from the Vorthen Emperor." Stone looked at the message on his screen. Kethmar was offering to disband the entire empire, surrender all military assets, and submit to human rule. In exchange, he asked only that his people be allowed to live. "What's our response?" The aide asked. Stone thought about the children who had died at Haven House. He remembered their faces from the recordings, their laughter that had been silenced forever. The Vorthens had started this war by killing innocents, and they would pay the full price. "Tell him we'll consider his offer," Stone said. "After Vorthen Prime surrenders unconditionally." The siege continued for another 3 months. Food became scarce on Vorthen Prime, then rare, then nearly impossible to find. The proud warrior race that had once terrorized half the galaxy was reduced to fighting over scraps of bread. Captain Ben Rodriguez, brother of the Marine who had captured Admiral Zexthal, led the final assault on the planet's defense grid. The orbital stations fell one by one, their crews either killed or forced to flee. "Last station is down," Rodriguez reported to Commander Adams. "The planet is defenseless." Adams nodded. Vorthen Prime lay open before the human fleet, helpless and defeated, but the humans didn't attack immediately. They waited, letting the fear build in the enemy population. Engineer Clark's new weapons had been tested throughout the war, and the results were terrifying. Entire Vorthen crews would be found dead at their posts, killed by sound waves that left their ships completely intact. The weapons became known as ghost makers among human forces. Dr. Lisa Carter had been assigned to the medical team preparing for the occupation of Vorthen Prime. She would help establish hospitals and treatment centers for the surviving population. But the woman who had once cared for all species equally was gone. "We'll treat human soldiers first," she told her staff. "Vorthens can wait." Her assistants nodded without question. The war had taught humanity to prioritize their own people above all others. Compassion for aliens was a luxury they could no longer afford. The final message came from Emperor Kethmar on a cold morning in the second year of the war. The transmission was broadcast to every human ship in the fleet and to every world in human space. "I am Kethmar, Emperor of the Vorthen people," the alien said, his voice broken and defeated. "I offer the complete and unconditional surrender of my empire to the human government. We accept full responsibility for the attack on Haven House and beg for mercy." The Emperor's image showed a broken alien, his gray skin pale and his dark eyes filled with despair. The proud warrior who had once commanded a galactic empire was reduced to pleading for his people's lives. President Stone's response was broadcast an hour later. The president stood behind his desk, his face showing no emotion as he spoke to the galaxy. "The surrender of the Vorthen Empire is accepted," Stone said. "However, the terms will be decided by human authority alone. The Vorthen government is dissolved. All military assets are forfeit. The population will be relocated to camps where they will learn new ways of thinking." The announcement sent shockwaves through the galaxy. Other species realized that humanity had become something new, something that other civilizations would have to reckon with. The peaceful traders and diplomats were gone, replaced by conquerors who showed no mercy. Admiral Kate Sullivan prepared her fleet for the final operation. The occupation of Vorthen Prime would mark the end of the war, but also the beginning of a new age. Humanity had learned that the galaxy was not safe, and they would never forget that lesson. "All ships prepare for planetary assault," Sullivan ordered. "This ends today." The negotiation took place aboard the UES Retribution, the massive human dreadnought that had been built specifically for this war. Admiral Kate Sullivan sat across from Emperor Kethmar in a room that felt more like a prison cell than a meeting. Chamber, the Vorthen Emperor looked nothing like the proud warrior he had been 2 years ago. His gray skin was pale and thin, his eyes sunken from months of stress and poor food. He wore simple clothes instead of his ceremonial armor, a broken ruler begging for mercy. "Admiral Sullivan," Kethmar said in careful English, "I offer you everything. Our technology, our resources, our complete submission. Please, just let my people live." Sullivan studied the alien with cold eyes. She had seen the footage from Haven House countless times, watched the small bodies being pulled from the rubble. This creature's orders had killed children who had trusted humans to protect them. "You killed our children," Sullivan said simply. "There can be no peace." The Emperor's face crumpled. "But we surrender completely. We offer no resistance." "Surely that must count for something." "It counts for nothing," Sullivan replied. "You crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. Your empire will be destroyed, your people scattered, your culture erased. That is justice." The meeting lasted only 15 minutes. There would be no negotiation, no compromise, no mercy. The Vorthens had sealed their fate the moment they bombed Haven House. General Peter Morgan stood on the surface of Vorthen Prime, watching as human troops moved through the capital city. The Vorthen population had been ordered to report to collection centers where they would be processed for relocation to camps on distant worlds. The city was eerily quiet. The proud Vorthan warriors offered no resistance, walking to their fate with bowed heads. Children clung to their parents, confused and frightened by the strange aliens who now controlled their world. "Sir," said Colonel Andy Baker, "the population centers are secure. We're finding no weapons, no signs of organized resistance." Morgan nodded. The Vorthans had been completely broken by the siege. 2 years of war had crushed their spirit as thoroughly as their military. "Begin the demolition of government buildings," Morgan ordered. "I want every symbol of Vorthan power destroyed." The human soldiers went about their work with mechanical efficiency. Palaces, monuments, and military academies were reduced to rubble. The history of the Vorthan Empire was being erased. One building at a time, Commander Jake Morrison returned to New Geneva Colony for the dedication ceremony. The place where Haven House had stood was now marked by a massive memorial, a black stone wall with the names of every child who had died in the attack. Jake walked slowly along the wall, reading the names carved into the dark stone, human names. Like Billy Cooper and Mary Johnson were mixed with alien names like Zexstar of Centauri, Prime and Velfara of the ethereal worlds. They had all been children, all innocent, all under human protection. President Stone stood at the podium, addressing the crowd that had gathered for the ceremony. Representatives from dozens of species had come to pay their respects, but the mood was somber rather than celebratory. "Today we remember 814 children who died simply because they trusted us to keep them safe," Stone said. "We failed them once. We will never fail again." The president's words carried across the galaxy through news broadcasts and diplomatic channels. Every species in known space heard the message. Humanity had learned the true cost of mercy, and they would never forget. Dr. Lisa Carter walked through the new Haven House that had been built on the colony. The facility was larger than the original, with the most advanced defense systems in the galaxy. Guard towers surrounded the building, and human soldiers patrolled the grounds constantly. The children living there now were different from those who had come before. They were refugees from the war, orphaned by the fighting between humans and Vorthans. Most had seen things that no child should ever witness. "Miss Lisa," called out a small human boy named Tommy Clark, "will the bad aliens come back?" Lisa knelt down beside the child, her face softening for a moment. "No, Tommy, the bad aliens are gone forever. You're safe now." But even as she spoke the words, Lisa knew that the galaxy had changed forever. The humans who protected these children were not the same peaceful species who had built the original Haven House. They were harder now, colder, more willing to use violence to protect what they loved. The Vorthan people were scattered across the galaxy in rehabilitation camps. The facilities were not cruel, but they were designed to break down everything that made someone Vorthan. The prisoners were taught new languages, new customs, new ways of thinking. Former Emperor Kethmer sat in his cell on a distant moon, writing his memoirs. The document would serve as a warning to future generations about the price of crossing certain lines. "We thought the humans were weak because they cared for others," he wrote. "We believed that compassion was a flaw that could be exploited. We were wrong. Their love for their children made them stronger than any warrior race, more dangerous than any weapon we possessed." The former emperor's writings would eventually be published throughout the galaxy, becoming required reading in military academies and diplomatic schools. The lesson was clear: humanity's mercy had limits, and those limits were absolute. Engineer Ben Clark continued to develop new weapons for the human military. The war was over, but the technology created during the conflict would shape the galaxy for generations. Human ships now carried weapons that could destroy entire fleets, and their defenses could stop any known attack. "We're not just stronger than we were before," Clark explained to a gathering of Federation officials. "We're stronger than anyone else in the galaxy. No one will ever threaten our children again." The engineer's words were both a promise and a warning. Humanity had emerged from the war as the dominant military power in known space, and they intended to keep that position. President Stone signed the Haven House Doctrine into law on the second anniversary of the bombing. The document became part of galactic law, establishing humanity's right to respond with total force to any attack on children under their protection. Any species that deliberately targets children will face the complete destruction of their civilization, the doctrine stated. This is not a threat or a negotiation point. This is a promise. The signing ceremony was attended by representatives from every major government in the galaxy. Some came to show support, others to study this new, harder version of humanity. All understood that the balance of power had permanently shifted. Admiral Kate Sullivan retired from active duty but remained as an advisor to the Federation military. She often visited the memorial at New Geneva Colony, standing quietly before the wall of names. The children listed there had not died in vain, their sacrifice had taught humanity valuable lessons about the true nature of the galaxy. Dr. Nancy Rivers published her study on the psychological effects of the war. Her findings were disturbing but important. Humanity had been fundamentally changed by the conflict, transformed from peaceful explorers into something much more dangerous. We are no longer the same species that first reached for the stars, Rivers wrote. We have learned that the universe is not a safe place, and we have adapted accordingly. Our children will grow up knowing that some lines cannot be crossed and that crossing them brings absolute consequences. The war was over, but its effects would last forever. Humanity had paid a terrible price for their education about galactic realities, but they had learned their lessons well. The galaxy was at peace, but it was a peace built on fear and respect for human power. In the end, the Vorthans had achieved the opposite of what they intended. They had wanted to show that human compassion was weakness, but instead they had created something far more dangerous. A species that combined unlimited love for their own children with unlimited willingness to destroy anyone who threatened them. The children of Haven House were gone, but they would never be forgotten. Their sacrifice had transformed humanity from peaceful idealists into the galaxy's most feared protectors. And that transformation was permanent.